they would see this music video that we watch now that's supposed to portray the good life, again, bikinis and bathing suits and martinis and all this kind of stuff. And they would say, because we've equated the good life with pleasure, they would say, that person or that thing looks like a hellish creature that's full of pleasure, but is missing the good life. It has nothing to do with the good life, because he doesn't even know what it means to be a human being in the full, robust sense of the word. So they would challenge the notion. So like utilitarianism, what we talked about the other day, they would challenge the very notion of, wait a minute, you're saying the good is that which brings the most pleasure. And then they would point to things like that. They would say, well, this brings pleasure and this thing's hellish. This thing doesn't even resemble a human being. Its intellectual capacity is completely down. Its whatever's completely down. It doesn't know how to relate to society. There's no morality. There's no, all of these sorts of things. They've said it doesn't even look human to me. Yet it's wallowing in quote unquote pleasure. Does that make sense? And so they're basing that view on a classic, again, what? Metaphysic, meaning that you abstract the nature and the essence of things as a clue to the meaning of right and wrong. So having said all of that, to come back full circle, that's what, say, someone like Plato, when he would say that type of sexual relationship is like eating dirt. It's not somebody reads it now like, oh, see how antiquated their view is. They don't even know what they're talking about. Really, when you understand what he means, you're like, oh, that makes, you may not agree with that, but you see how that makes sense in light of reason. They would look at us and say, you're a completely unreasonable people. You're not logical. You've given up, everything that makes you human, is what they would say. So what started that whole tangent was that would be the same reason. So if somebody was to say I'm this, quote unquote, and I would say, I don't understand that. I don't know what you mean by that. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't see how that coincides. Again, like we talked about the very first couple classes, I don't see how that coincides with reality. Like if reality is something we discover and not something we invent, then you're literally inventing something that doesn't coincide with the reality. It's like saying I'm climbing to the Eiffel Tower and I believe with all of my heart that I can fly. And then you jump off. Reality just doesn't care in regards to the sincerity of your belief. So in regards to that, I'm this, reality doesn't care. Like you say this, but to me, it looks like you're on the top of the Eiffel Tower claiming that you're a bird or claiming that you can fly, when reality says, no, you're not. So that's one of the whole big arguments regarding a lot of contemporary movements and classical philosophy, is that, well, all right, is reality something we invent or is it something we discover? Because if it's something we discover, then a lot of these new cultural hot button issues, they immediately fall to pieces. But if reality is just something you invent, something you create for yourself, anything and everything and all these sorts of what we were talking about, these cultural hot button topics. But I happen to be in the camp, again, because I just think there are better arguments that reality is something that we bump into or that we run up against and that we have to conform to, as opposed to trying to make reality conform to me. That I can't climb the Eiffel Tower and say I'm a bird and jump. Reality just doesn't care. And then we could go into example after example of how, well, so is reality something I'm discovering? Like math, can I invent math, right? Or is that something we discover, right? I can't just arbitrarily make 2 + 2 = 9, right? Because once you just come to understand what it means to say what 2 is, and then what it is just for 2, and then you put those together, it just is 4, right? If you come to understand those concepts, you understand that they're not arbitrary. And so it's the same thing again in regards to just reality. Once you understand what that is, then you just can't invent, quote unquote, whatever. So anyway, that's our tangent. Now we got to talk about Immanuel Kant's Deontological Ethics. This is my least favorite ethical theory to talk about because it's so unbelievably convoluted. That's not to say that there's not just, some serious intellectual, ingenuity and powerhouseness, to invent a word, behind it. It's just not utilitarianism, right? Utilitarianism is what? Hey, whatever provides the most pleasure for the most people, that's the good. That's pretty easy to understand immediately, right? Remember how we talked about that was one of the appeals, that it's not just this wild abstract something. Well, Kant's is this wild abstract something. And so we got to go through that. Now, anybody have anything in regards to utilitarianism before we get started? On Immanuel Kant's Dialogical Ethics. You did one of those faces where you look up and you're about to say something and you just completely fade out. Like she went about this. Anybody have anything to say?
Have you ever seen Friends? Oh my gosh. Do you know that when
I grew up on that garbage.
With Ross?
Huh?
Phoebe's fiance, they had a
Start over what? I was still at.
Ross and the guy that Phoebe married. You know who I'm talking about?
The game.
It's been a long time.
No, it was the last guy she married that she actually stayed
Oh,
there.
okay.
See, it's been so long because you got to remember, I watched all this when it was there, in the 90s. So it's been that long.
Episode, over 30 times. I can quote it.
Yeah.
It was like a friend reference. Did nobody buy it? He looks over his friend. He's like that. It was something.
All right. So anyway, Phoebe marries somebody. Oh, so you weren't going anywhere with utilitarianism?
Well, nobody knows. I was just saying that Ross. I don't know. It was just what you said she did.
Oh.
What they did on the show. It was completely irrelevant to
Oh, my
I just need to take one out. I'm sorry.
Friends is still ruining my life 20 years after high school. I'm just kidding. I liked Friends then.
I've seen every
I liked it then. I'm just kind of done with it. I watched all of them.
There's some really shitty ones, but there's more good ones than that.
I watched every one of them. We watched them every Thursday night. Hey, man, did you watch Friends last night? Yeah. All right. So does anybody have anything in regards to utilitarianism before we keep going? Nothing? Nobody? All right, so let's get started with this deontology. I'm honestly just trying to put this off. All right, so I'll probably have to read a few things. What?
I can't stand this guy, so I can understand why.
You can't stand Kant?
Yes.
Why not?
I don't know. I don't know.
He didn't know how to speak English properly. He's a walking thesaurus in most of his words.
Kant is an intellectual madman. He's an intellectual powerhouse. I don't agree with Kant,
What
but
I'm
he's
saying is I
genius.
don't agree. Morality is not.
He just needs to learn to put down thesaurus.
I think you just need to expand your vocabulary.
Oh.
All right, so what kind of ethic is a deontological ethicate?
You want to talk about vocabulary?
Yeah. See, I invent words. How you like that? What is a deontological type ethic? What is it? Remember, utilitarianism was concerned with what? The consequences, right? Right, how we ought to behave. But all of these are going to be that, right? All of these ethics that we're talking about, all these ethical theories are supposed to be how we ought to behave. So they're going to give you what? Some sort of method as to how you put it into practice, right? So you come up upon some circumstance, you're supposed to be able to use this to know what you're supposed to do, right? So method for how you ought to behave. Remember, it's not describing, it's how you ought to be. And remember, they're also going to try to what? Tell you what is good, right? Tell you what is good. The right and the wrong, right? The right, the wrong. So remember, we always have to keep in the back of our mind, what's grounding the good, right? What's grounding it? So in utilitarianism, that seemed to be, one of the problems again, what grounds this? Because remember, in some sense, they're trying to give you real rights and real wrongs, right? Remember, especially apart from, say, God or divine, revelation or whatever, all those kind of things. They're trying to give you what? Real rights and real wrongs, right? Now, which was kind of one of the big problems with, remember, utilitarianism. Aside from the ones we talked about, some of the biggest ones was just, remember, utilitarianism, there wasn't anything that was, quote unquote, really wrong. Why? At the end of the day. Because any behavior could end up being the thing that gives you the most pleasure, right? Remember, like we talked about, you put tie the girl up on the island or whatever, the most atrocious or awful behavior at the end of the day, there's nothing really wrong in and of itself, right? Because that could be something that's utilized, remember utilitarianism, that could be something that's utilized to bring about the greatest pleasure or flourishing or whatever for everybody else, right? So there's never really any behavior that in and of itself is completely wrong, because you remember, you're just trying to get the consequences. Now, Kant stands in direct opposition to that. He says that what? There are things that are absolutely wrong at all times, at all places, for all people. Because what's he want to give you? Kant wants to give you what? He wants to give you absolute or objective morality, right? Right? And he thinks that he can do this, again, what? Sans God or sans, any sort of divine whatever. He says that he can ground objective and absolute morality, that there really is objective and absolute moral principles. So remember, this is principle based. Remember, it's not just the consequences. In fact, Kant is so anti-consequences that he says you shouldn't even worry about the consequences when you come to a particular decision. You should worry about what? To use common vernacular, you do the right thing, hell with the consequences, right? You do the right thing. You let the consequences handle themselves. No matter what they do, no matter what the consequences are, you do the right thing. Now, how's he going to get to this? Does anybody know how he's going to get to it? Supposed to have already read your book. All right, so let's read a few things.
Forget I have it.
So let's go ahead and read a few things, right? And then we'll try to cash out a lot of this stuff, because again, even my notes are just scattered and all over the place, because I mean, you really need a whole course just to talk about Kant's version of deontological ethics. So we're going to just try to smash out as much as we can in this one class. So anyway, let's look at this. Like we said, it's a principle-based system, right? Principle-based. So one of the big things about Kant is this. Let me just read this off to you. I wrote this down years ago. Here's some keywords: duty, deontological, the goodwill. So just kind of absorb this first. If you try to write it, you're going to miss a lot of this, and then we'll try to cash it out. So Kant, again, on the other, as opposed to utilitarianism, Kant, on the other hand, has a very sophisticated moral philosophy. Kant believes in the existence of objective right and wrong. However, he grounds these, or tries to ground these, in pure, does anybody know, reason or rationality, or what is rational. Kant introduces what he calls the hypothetical imperatives and the categorical imperatives. These are going to be huge, and these are where we're going to talk a lot about the categorical imperative. So Kant introduces what he calls the hypothetical imperatives and the categorical imperatives. So naturally, the hypothetical imperatives are if-then guides to behavior that are not necessarily objective. So like, if you want to make a good grade in class, then you need to study. That's a hypothetical imperative. Or if you want to eat a lot for supper tonight, then you need to skip lunch. You see how those are just kind of, they're not necessarily at all any sort of morally obligatory kind of thing. There's no moral obligation behind them. They're just hypothetical. If then, if you want to do this, then you do that, right? Now keep that in mind. Now, the categorical imperative This is what his system is going to revolve around. This is what Kant's deontological ethic is going to revolve around, is this thing called the categorical imperative. And again, we'll try to cash all this stuff out. But the categorical imperative is Kant's attempt at true objective morality. The first is that one should act in accord in such a way that his actions be carried out by all, as if it were a universal law. Let me say that again. This categorical imperative is that one should act in accord in such a way that his actions could be carried out by all, as if it were a universal law. Meaning, again, that this categorical imperative, everyone should act in a way that if they acted in that certain way, that it could be universalized. And his word for this is universalizability. It's way too early in the morning to even try to say that. Universalizability. There we go. Universalizability. Now, here's the catch, though. Here's the catch of that. The first one should act in accord in such a way that his actions could be carried out as if they're universal law, and I even have in all caps here when I wrote this years ago, without a contradiction. Because this is your big key. This is how he's going to try to say that it's objective and it's absolute and it's not arbitrary or any of these sorts of things. He says, without a contradiction. This is an important point in that most mistake Kant's first imperative as if it were solely concerned with the consequences of behavior. What do I mean by that? Have you ever heard your mom say, now, Mad Madison, if you act that way, what if everybody acted that way? Have you ever heard her say that? A lot of people say that that's what Kant's going after. So how might your mom say something like that? How might she say, what might she mean by that? If your mom were to say, now look, if you act that way, what if everybody acted like you're acting right now? Could the world operate if everybody's doing what you're doing right now? Right, so that you're lying or that you're stabbing people or whatever, right? So if you got a guy running around murdering everybody, and so, well, what if everybody murdered everybody? Or then there'd be nobody left because everybody's murdered everybody, right? So you can't apply that at all, right? You can't live that action out. You can't will that to be universal for everyone at all places at all times, because if everybody did that, they would just kill everybody, right? Now, Kant's more subtle than that, because that's just a consequence, right? But what is consequence? What ethical theory is consequence? That's utilitarianism, right? Kant's not concerned about just the consequences. Otherwise, he would just be a utilitarian, right? So that can't be what Kant's going after, even though that might be a byproduct of it. A lot of people think that's what they think that's the point of Kant. Well, yeah, okay, look, if you tried to do that, well, then everybody'd run around murdering everybody, and that would be real unpleasant or whatever. Kant is much more nuanced than that, because that's just consequentialism. That's just utilitarianism. That's what he's arguing against, right? So just as an aside, if you lie and if all people lie, then Earth would be rather unpleasant. No, that's consequentialism. Kant is more logical than this. His concern is more to the point that if you break a promise, for instance, this is why it'd be wrong to break promises. That if you break a promise and all people break a promise, then the very concept of promise is a contradiction and meaningless. How so? No, not just that you would keep it, right? But there would be no such thing as a promise, right? Because what does a promise mean? A promise means to hold your word. But if everybody breaks their promises, then the word promise means at the same time, in the same sense, to not hold your word, right? Or look at it this way. Imagine a guy, say you're about to lie to somebody. Kant says, can you universalize that without contradiction? So let's say the guy's holding a little sign that says, everyone ought to lie. Well, if that guy has a sign that says everyone ought to lie, well, then at that same time, if everyone ought to lie, well, then he's lying right then, right? If everyone ought to lie, well, then he's lying when he says everyone ought to lie. But if he's lying when he says everyone ought to lie, then that's a contradiction. And so the very concept is what? Married bachelor, something like that. So Kant's saying, like, see, this is what he means to say that if you can't universalize your behavior in that moment without creating a contradiction, then it's irrational. Meaning that and he would say that it's wrong. It's absolutely objectively wrong, because you can't universalize it without creating contradiction. Not just that everyone would run around lying, which makes the world unpleasant. That's just consequentialism, right? That's just utilitarianism, it creates a contradiction in the concept. It doesn't make any sense. So this is what Kant's trying to go after. This is how he's trying to ground objective and absolute and true morality. Are you following with me so far? All right, again, we're going to try to break this down a little more. Right now, we're just kind of hedge hogging through it. So Kant is more logical than this. His concern, again, is that if you break a promise and all people break a promise, then the concept of promise is a contradiction and meaningless. So here, the second imperative is that one should never treat an individual as simply as a means to an end, but as an end. Does that make sense? This is one of his big things. You don't treat people as merely a means to an end. You treat people as what? An end in and of themselves. Meaning, and so Kant wants to say that they will have what? People have what? Something like this, intrinsic value. That people aren't a means to an end. Right? Now, we're going to have a question going to come up here in a second. And something from Augustine is going to come up here as well. But I think that we can relatively agree that right off the bat, that's a good thing, right? If you have a system of morality that doesn't have people as an end in and of themselves, or that people shouldn't be treated as a means to an end, then you're going to have a weird, I would argue, wrong sense of morality. Utilitarianism doesn't treat people as an end in and of themselves, does it? It's just concerned about what? The stats and the numbers and all that stuff. If all that plugs out and works out right? Because no person has any intrinsic value, right? No single person does, right? It's just the group, right? The numbers, right? All right, so let me skip this about Augustine. We'll get to that in a second. All right, so this third imperative is that of personal autonomy, meaning that we are the legislators of morality, as we are to reason each action as to conclude as if it should be universal. So essentially just that we have the capability of being rational. This is also what Kant says gives us this dignity, is that we and we alone have this ability to be completely rational in what we think about, what we do, and how we come to our understanding of what it means to be moral, of what it means to have something absolutely right or absolutely wrong. We can come to this via what? Reason, right? We can reason to this. This makes us different. This makes us dignified in regards to everything else. So remember, Kant's system is deontological. That it is concerned with the facing rule, and the consequence does not matter. Remember, it's about the principle. It's about the rule. It's about what you do in the moment, about it being right or wrong and not the consequence, right? It's deontological. One is to base his actions solely by duty grounded in reason, not by fear of punishment, not for anticipation of reward, or not because you have empathy, all this kind of stuff. So when we talk about duty, Kant thinks that you are really a moral person if you're acting out of a sense of duty. So he would say this: let's say that your wife wants you to cut the grass. And not say that you like to cut the grass. And so you're like, all right, I like cutting it anyway. I can get to be outside for a while and blah, blah, blah. And your wife wanted you to do it. Did you do the right thing according to Kant? Did you do a morally right thing? Kant would say no. Why? He said, because you like cutting the grass. Who doesn't do what they don't like to do anyway, right? He would say, it's almost like, man, I hate cutting the grass. All right, I'll do it though because my wife asked me to do it. He would say that guy did the morally right thing because he hated doing it and he did it out of duty, not because he liked it.
So basically saying the only things that we do right are things that we actually don't want to do.
Right, or that you do because simply based on duty and you're rationalizing that is the right action. Because you like doing it, remember, because he's concerned with the goodwill, he's concerned with the motivation. It's really weird because two people could do the exact same thing, and he says one is not doing it as a morally good thing. He's just doing it because he likes doing it. So he's doing it for the wrong reason. Huh?
There's no motivation because he just likes doing it.
Right, he just likes doing it. Now, this is where, this is where classical philosophy would be like, wait a minute, why can't you come to like doing the right thing? Well, I mean, I think there's something to it. I mean, before we just dismiss it right offhand, I mean, I think there's something to that, right? So think about this. What if, you know, what if you've been raised your entire life to hate, abhor, you know, that's kind of we talked about the other day, yappy dogs or whatever, those things. And what if you've been raised your entire life with a yappy dog? You just love the things, right? You just absolutely love them. Well, let's say that there's a fire in someone's house and you're, you know, riding your bike by, you're jogging, you're doing your morning workout or whatever, and you're running by, and some old lady's like, my dog is in the house, and you see that it's a yappy dog. And let's say the one guy who's raised them just loves them. He immediately has this feeling of like, oh, he loves those things, right? So he wants to run in and grab it and get it out, right? And so let's say he does that. He saves the yappy dog and gives it to the old lady. Well, let's say the guy's running by and he's jogging and he sees the house on fire and the old lady's crying. She's like, my yappy dog. Well, she didn't say my yappy dog. She's like, my dog. Well, the guy can somehow see through the window or whatever, that it's a yappy dog, right? And he's like, I hate these freaking things. I can't stand yappy dog. But he's like, but it's the right thing to do. Is to say, so he runs in and gets it, even though he hates doing it. Something quote unquote morally right. Would you say which one would you say did a step above? The one that hated him, right? Now again, that's right. Well, but Kant would say, but you did it for the wrong reason, or the first guy did it for the wrong reason. Again, because he'd say you just did it because you loved it. Who wouldn't do what they would love to do? Now that's where classical philosophy, Aristotle, Plato, the Greeks, that's where they'd say, oh, wait a minute, why can't you become the kind of person that likes doing what you ought to do? Because you kind of have it's kind of a cold kind of gloominess that if really you're only really doing the right thing out of a sense of duty and you don't even really get any enjoyment out of it at all, right? But again, I think there's something there that there's some sort of little nugget of truth there, but we don't want to totally dismiss that right off the bat. What are you going to say, Lacey?
Immanuel Kant, I'm trying to think if I'm thinking of the same person. Did he say some like very controversial things?
Well, everything is controversial. In regards to what?
But, like,
Well, I mean, there's not many Kantians now. So, I mean, a lot of people don't think it works, but.
I'm trying to think if he's the same guy that like I'll see quotes by and I'm like, that is completely wrong. Or, like,
Yeah, I don't know. I would say that probably about a lot of philosophers. That's wrong.
okay, I was like, I don't.
If you think of something, say it, and I'll tell you if it's Kant or not. So let's keep going real quick. So one is to base his action solely by duty. Again, duty grounded in what? Reason, right? Not by fear of punishment, not by anticipation of reward, any of that stuff. The goodwill, this is the quote unquote goodwill, is huge for Kant. So this is paramount for him. So obviously one may perform the right action so that his wife will not leave or his friends will speak well of him or whatever, or if he keeps his business. But Kant states that these reasons are simply egotistical and have nothing to do with performing one's duty with correct intention and motive, right? Because remember, what's his motive? That you're doing something out of duty, grounded in reason. Now, before we keep going on, let's talk about one of the things real quickly we want to say about Kant is that Kant was really serious about this idea of freedom, because he's the one that came up with this famous axiom, or this famous little quip that an ought implies can. What does that mean? So what do you think Kant means when he says an ought implies a can? Ought implies can.
Like, I know I can do something, but now I have to decide whether I want to or not.
Well, reverse that. I mean, you're kind of right. But Kant says if you ought to do something, it implies that you can do it, right? So he thinks that you have to have freedom, true significant freedom. So Kant says that you have to be able to reason to that, right? You can't just be completely determined, right? And ought implies a can. And this is where also Kant is going to say too that there has to be some sort of eternality, about God and all this kind of stuff. Because if you ought to behave a certain way, but you don't have enough time to, then there has to be some sort of eternality. But anyway, we don't even have time to get into all that kind of stuff. Now, again, moral obligations don't vary on the circumstances. Why? Because they're absolute, right? They're objective. The circumstances don't matter in regard to his stuff, right? So I want to throw up some of these details here again, then we can start to cash it out, right? Remember, it recognizes that one's duty is inherently good apart from any consequences that it's produced. The goodwill is the will that acts for the sake of duty. Since this is just our intro class, let's just really start to cue in on what he means by his categorical imperative, because that's really what I really want you guys to be able to understand and grasp and be able to talk about if you have to, is this categorical imperative. And then we'll talk about some of the issues or problems here. What do you think the positive of Kant's categorical imperative is? What is the point of the thing first? What is the point of his categorical imperative?
To make people do things that they might not normally do.
Well, that's kind of a side product. It tells you how you ought to behave. But what is he trying to do? Remember, what does he want his system to do? He wants his system to give you true, right, and wrong, right? Something that's not arbitrary, something that's not just made up, right? He wants to give you absolute morality. He wants to give you objective morality. How does he think the categorical imperative does that? How does the categorical imperative, what is the categorical imperative? At least the first statement of it. You don't have to necessarily worry about the others at this time, but at least the first statement of what is it? What is the categorical imperative? Right, well, it will give you a moral obligation, but what is it? You should always act in such a way that what? That's right. Act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Right? Without a contradiction. Does that make sense? You should look, when you get in a situation and you're looking at the situation, if the way you act, could it be willed that this be a universal law without creating contradictions? Does that make sense? So what are your thoughts about that? Do you think that's a good thing? Okay, let's wait till we get to that, because I think that's a valid point. But how about this? Should morality be reasonable? Yeah, I think so. I think morality should be reasonable. Should it be rational? Should it be logical? I think so. I mean, think about it the other way. Think about it from the opposite spectrum. What would it mean to say that my morality is completely unreasonable? My morality makes no sense whatsoever. What would that mean? I don't even know, right? I don't even know what that would mean. So I think that it's a good thing that morality should in some way make sense. It should be reasonable, right? There should be something there that's rational. Now, let's talk about what Piper said. What might be a problem with that, though, if that and that alone is the way to ground objective morality? What might be the problem with that? In what sense? What do you mean perfect? Perfect person.
Somebody's eventually going to do something that contradicts something.
Right, but Kant would just say, well, that just means they're wrong. That just means that they're wrong. But Kant seems to assume that everybody would, by using rationality, would come to what? The same conclusions. So I think that's what we can say what Piper said a minute ago about being very lofty. Because wait a minute, don't we have all sorts of ethical theories that are, at least in some sense, rational and reasonable, but stand in direct opposition to one another? Like, at least in one sense, utilitarianism is rational or reasonable in the sense that it's a thought out process, right?
It's not great.
Right. But it's the quote, it's not quote, just made up in a barrel somewhere. I mean, and then we have what? We have Aristotle's virtue ethics, right? We have natural law. We have Deontology, right? We have divine command theory. We have situational ethics. We have egotism. Like, all of those are in some sense philosophical or rational or thought through, right? So just because, again, we've talked about this before, just because we have disagreement doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a right answer, that Kant's not necessarily right in what he's saying. But if that's the way that you have to go about making your ethical decisions, is that not unbelievably convoluted? In some sense, I mean, think about it. When was the last time that you went up to a situation and you had to make some sort of moral choice, and you went through this long, convoluted, abstract process of, all right, if I do this, will it create a contradiction by which that if this universe, I mean, do you think that most anybody could employ this type of ethic? Again, just because you can employ it doesn't mean it's wrong, but that has to be taken into account in some sense, right? So on the one hand, we want to say that, yes, morality should be reasonable. We don't want to say that morality is completely unreasonable. That doesn't even make any sense at all. Literally, it doesn't make any sense. If you say that your morality is nonsensical or it's not reasonable, I don't even know what that means. But at the same time, if you're trying to ground it completely 100% in reason alone, then that seems to be difficult because, one, we've already pointed out two things. If it's grounded just in reason alone, then that assumes that everyone would come to the same conclusions, which is just obviously not the case. Two, it seems to be a very convoluted way of trying to make a moral decision, especially when most people just aren't philosophers. Could you imagine some just simple-minded, and I don't mean this in a bad way. I don't mean a simpleton. I just mean simple-minded farmer trying to make a moral decision, running through Kant's categorical imperatives, the 3 or 4 and instantiations of that. I mean, that seems really counterintuitive to the way that we experience our moral choice making, right? Again, that doesn't make it mean it's wrong, but it's just odd. But then problems that we might have. Let me write something here so we don't forget this. Is that why do we have a moral obligation to the principle of rationality? That seems kind of, because remember, one of Kant's things was that the only thing that really can kind of ground moral obligations is persons, right? I mean, that was one of Kant. So Kant said, if there was imagine if there were no persons on the planet, there were no persons at all that existed, would moral obligations exist? Say, like, a rock has a moral obligation to that other rock over there. So that doesn't make sense, right? So we said the only way that moral obligation makes sense is like with persons, right? But then to turn around and say that we have some sort of moral obligation to be rational. Why do you have a moral obligation to be rational? Other than just to be rational. Remember Kant's hypotheticals imperatives what were they? They weren't necessarily morally obligatory, were they? You had no moral obligation to say, if you want to make good grades, then you should study, or if you want to eat good tonight, then you should skip dinner, right? But it seems like if at the end of the day, in order to be moral, we have to be rational, it sounds like almost like that's reducible to a hypothetical imperative itself. If you want to be rational, then you ought to be moral. But what if you don't care about being rational? Now, you would live a very inconsistent life, but does that sound the exact same as living an immoral life because you don't want to be rational? Does that make sense? Because listen, it doesn't seem like that to be completely 100% rational is also to be completely a moral person. It seems like there has to be more than just rationality. What do I mean? If you miss a problem, say your kid misses a problem on their long division when they're studying, mathematics or whatever at the house. If they miss a problem, they've made an intellectual mistake, right? They've made a misstep in their calculation, right? Somewhere along the line, they made a decision that wasn't rational. Is it right? I mean, if you make a mistake on your math, somewhere you've made intellectually, you've went wrong somewhere, right? But have they done anything immoral? Do you get what I'm saying? So if morality is grounded, if Kant tries to ground this in rationality, then it seems like that to miss a math problem because they've gone intellectually wrong somewhere would be parallel to making a moral mistake. But we don't see those as the same. We don't say that, oh, well, Piper was on the way home today and he saw some lady, that old lady that needed a flat tire changed. Or not even that. Let's just say in your mind, you're like, well, what if everybody drove by people that needed help, all this kind of stuff. Well, at worst, Piper, if he doesn't do that, then he's created a contradiction and he was irrational. Right? But what if Piper says, all right, I'm fine with being irrational for the moment? Doesn't it seem like there's something else there? Right. But we ought to if you miss a math problem, because what have you done? No, what have you done? You've went wrong intellectually, but you also went wrong intellectually, when you didn't help the old lady, right? But when you miss a math problem, you went wrong intellectually. And so if morality is grounded in just rationality, and Kant would say, well, but wait a minute, the persons, that helps it too. But remember what you said, what makes the persons is our ability. What gives us our dignity with persons is to be rational, right? And so if you're trying to ground objective morality just in rationality, no one is saying that it should be irrational. I mean, it should make sense. But it seems like that by itself can't get the job done, right? That seems to be at least something that should have to be thought through. And maybe there's a good response from Kant there. I mean, I haven't seen that in our readings. I've got literally 3 books right out sitting here. Our textbook, this textbook I've used for a different intro to philosophy class, and then this introduction to ethics textbook that has a whole section on it. And so again, maybe Kant, so if you want to check Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, then you're free to do so. But I can't find anything in these that kind of go after or at least address that type of difficulty there. Now, one of the other difficulties here, because to me that seems to be huge. One of the other difficulties is, all right, when I say everyone, I'm going to lie, that seems easy. We can easily construct a thing where that makes a contradiction, right? Because if everyone ought to lie, well, then that guy ought to be lying. But if he says he ought to lie, well, then when he says that, he's lying, which creates contradiction, right? But when you get down to the nitty-gritty of individual situations, depending on how you word your action, it might be a contradiction in one way, but then not what? It might not be a contradiction in another way that you word it, right? So it seems like when you're trying to make these decisions, you can word it in a way where there's not some sort of contradiction, or that it doesn't sound like it would be bad to be universalized, right? But then if you word it a different way, then it would be a contradiction. So let's take the lying thing. You're going to lie, but then what if you word it and say something like, I want to protect as many people as I can. Can I universalize that? Something like that. Now Kant might say, wait a minute, you've got to look at the means the means and by which you're going to do that. But again, it still seems like, and this is just a standard objection, is that it still seems like by the way that you word your moral choice, that it could come out as quote unquote fine. But if you word it a different way, then it's not fine. And again, does this just not seem incredibly convoluted to try to make ethical decisions this way, right? Now, here's probably the last thing we'll have time to talk about, but it's one of the Some of the others I like because they're a little more philosophical, but this is kind of the one I think you'll easily relate to immediately. Is that, remember, Kant, your morals are absolute, right? They're absolute, they're objective, right? Moral relativity, moral relativism sucks, Kant says, right? I think he's right in that. But he tries to ground it this way. So what do you do with conflicting absolutes under Kant's system? What do you do? Remember, you cannot lie. It's never okay to lie, right? So let's give the classic example. The Jews are hiding in the basement. The Nazis show up your door. You have any Jews down here? What should you do? Now, just right now, what should you do?
Lie.
Right. What does Kant say you do? You tell the truth. You have to tell the truth. I mean, is that a problem? Because remember, this is where utilitarianism, at least in one way, if we don't examine it more in depth, it looks attractive. Because remember, at least we're concerned about the consequences here, right? But now we've got a problem with Kant's ethical system because, wait a minute, you're telling me I have to tell the truth at the sake of slaughtering 20, people in the basement, women and children and little girls and little boys, like, I have to tell the truth? Kant says, yeah. You have to act out of your duty. Or who remembers the old, remember the movie The Shining? All right, you remember when he's whacking the door with the axe, and he sticks his head through the door and he says, here's Johnny. All right, if that guy let's say that happens at your house, and the guy's wife has run across her yard, come in your house at 3 o'clock in the morning, is hiding under the bed, and you've got your wife in there with her, and you're like, look, here's the shotgun. This dude comes over, you protect her. That guy comes running across the yard, starts hammering on your door with an axe, and he sticks his head through the thing. Where's my wife? I can't lie. She's right in here. Does that seem like the right thing to do?
Under his though, couldn't you just be like,
Why should I hear it? So was my shotgun.
you
Yeah.
just start like
Yeah.
doing sign language?
Well, I mean, and that's one of the things. Some people would say, well, there's always some way you could quote unquote work it out. But in my short, lifetime that I've been alive, I just think it's naive to say that you don't really run into conflicting moral, that there's not real moral dilemmas, right? Like, for instance, who says that if you promised your wife or your husband or whatever that you're going to meet her for dinner, say you've missed the last 3 and you promise you're going to meet her and the children for dinner, who believes you have a standing obligation to do that? I do, right? But let's say on the way home, you're driving home and you see a woman on the side of the road and she stopped to, again, change her tire, and her little boy fell into a pond or whatever, a water reservoir, and he's drowning. And she says, please, please, please stop. Please help my child here. Please save him. What do I do at that point? Do I break my promise to my wife and miss dinner again and save the little boy? Or do I say, well, I promised my wife and I got to keep going. Sorry. What do you do? I think you stop and help. If you have to think about this for more than 30 seconds, or more than 30 seconds, if you have to think of this more than 3 seconds, something's wrong with you. That you save the child.
And then take him to the dinner and say, this is why I was late.
Right.
And
Well, if your wife doesn't understand that, I think something's wrong with her, right? If you don't say, well, I saved a toddler. I don't give a you promised us you'd eat. We had these reservations at Longhorn, right? So, if your system doesn't recognize, so one, if your system doesn't even recognize real rights and wrongs, I think there's probably something really wrong with your system. But then 2, if your system doesn't recognize true moral dilemmas, that there really can be a time in which true moral obligations come up against one another. If your system doesn't say that's possible, then I think something's wrong with your system. I think. Again, you may not find that convincing, but I think there are really examples of moral dilemmas. that come up against one another. So that's enough time, or that's all of our time for today. And we'll probably maybe hopefully wrap this up on Monday if I'm in the mood. If I'm not, we'll just go into the next thing. But I really want you to try to think about this one. And then Monday or whenever, what day's our class? Tuesday? Think of something, like try to think this through so we can talk about this a little bit. Been one of the more difficult classes because you guys are the most silent out of any of them. So with that said, we'll continue this discussion.
That's been on.